Hi and good evening, everyone. So I will give you some time to come in. So it's Monday. It's 10 p.m. Sorry for the slight delay. I was busy working on slides and I still have to work on some slides. So unfortunately, I have to keep it short today because, as I just said, I'm quite busy and it's Monday, so this week will be a bit stressy because the project is in a kind of preparation phase. We will start the project, I think, in 2 weeks, but nevertheless, we need to prepare everything. We need to work on the concepts and I'm mainly busy with benchmarking, and this is also the topic for today. So I see people are joining the chat. Hi everyone. So as always, if you join the chat, then let us know where you come from. And maybe you write how your day was. Mine was quite interesting, quite productive. And I hope you had a good start in the week. Cool. I see people are joining. Hi everybody. So today, let's start with the topic because I only have like 10 to 15 minutes today to do the live. So the topic for today is benchmarking in management consulting. And maybe you can write in the chat if you already know what benchmarking is or if you had some experience already in benchmarking. As always, if you have any questions, then just write them in the chat and I will answer them afterwards. But first, as always, I will go through the content. Cool. So let's talk about benchmarking in management consulting. So why are we talking about that? We're talking about that because of two reasons. So the first one is that obviously I'm currently doing benchmarks, and if you follow my stories, you know that I'm working on a kind of a benchmarking exercise at the moment. But the second reason is that someone asked me when I asked you guys to make suggestions about topics for the lives, I was asked to talk about development of hypotheses in management consulting. And this is where benchmarking plays a huge role. And that's why we talk about today about benchmarking. So first of all, let's talk about what benchmarking actually is. And for those of you who do not know what benchmarking is, let me tell you, benchmarking, the basics are very, very simple, okay? So what you do if you benchmark is that you can compare certain KPIs of your client with KPIs of other companies to understand the level of performance of your client, okay? So you compare KPIs between your client and other peer group companies to understand or to get a better understanding about the performance of the client. And you can do benchmarking in various areas, okay? So it's the typical areas where you do benchmarking is kind of revenue benchmarking. It's very common to do a kind of cost benchmarking, but you can also do some kind of organizational benchmarking. So what do I mean by that? A revenue benchmarking would mean, for example, that you compare the revenue of your client with the revenues of the peer group, like competitors, okay? It's the same with cost benchmarking. So that in this case, you would compare cost structures of your client with a peer group. So for example, with competitors. And it can be the same if you do a organizational benchmarking. In this case, you kind of compare your client organization or certain KPIs of your client organization with the same KPI of a peer group, which usually means competitors. So this is what you usually do, okay? So you simply compare certain KPIs between your client and a certain peer group, usually the competitors. The reason or the question is obviously, so why do you use this? So why are consultants very often do this kind of exercise? The reason why you do it, this is because you want to develop hypotheses, okay? So usually you do this at the start of a project. In my case, for example, right now we are working on a transformation project, okay? So the client expects us to increase their EBITDA, okay? And obviously, we know the client a bit, but as an outsider, it's always hard to get to get an idea what typical areas of improvement might be. So this is why we do a benchmarking. Okay, so we take what we actually do at the moment is to do a cost benchmarking. So we take certain cost positions of the client and we simply benchmark it against the main competitors. And this gives us a very, very good overview about or an overview of the areas of improvements of the client. And usually, I mean, a benchmarking project typically lasts, let's say, about 6 and 8 weeks. It depends a little bit on the scope. But although this seems to be a lot of work, it's actually a very quick way to develop initial hypotheses that you can test and that are the basis for your improvement measures, okay? So this is why usually in every strategy project and in every transformation project, actually in most of the projects that management consultants do, benchmarking is at the very beginning of this project to develop a certain kind of or a bundle of hypotheses that you can use throughout the project. I will answer the questions afterwards, okay? But thank you for your questions, very good questions. So we talked about what benchmarking is. So it's comparing KPIs of your client with the same KPIs of your competitors to understand the performance, to get a better understanding of the performance of your client. We talked about why we use it. We use it to generate first hypotheses that you can work with throughout the project. For example, to identify improvement potential. So the big question, how do you do it? Okay, and I wrote down like 8 steps on how to conduct a benchmarking. And these are actually the same steps that I am currently doing, okay? So step number 1 is that you define the areas or the functions where you want to conduct a benchmark. So what we do currently is that we go through all the functions. So this means like obviously all the overhead functions like purchasing, HR, finance, controlling and so on. So all the support functions, but also like the main functions like production, sales, and so on. So we make a list of all the functions that we want to benchmark. And this is step number 1. And this you usually have to do in close collaboration with the client. So sit down and make a list of all the functions and areas that you actually want to benchmark. This is step number 1. Step number 2 is that for each function, you define the KPIs that you want to use for benchmarks, okay? So what you usually do, and this is something that you can do across all the functions, is that you benchmark the ratio, for example, of FTE per revenue, okay? So let's say, for example, HR FTE per revenue that the company as a whole makes. Okay, this is a benchmarking KPI that you can do for all the functions, but you can also use some more specific KPIs for each functions. So for example, to understand the sales performance, one very typical KPI that usually everyone uses is revenue per FTE. Obviously, this says a lot about the performance of the salespeople. But you could also use a lot of different functions, KPIs. Like for example, in the purchasing department, you usually say like purchasing volume per FTE. And this gives you a very good overview about how the purchasing department, I mean, if there are too many people or if they are if there's a very great performance because there are only a few FTE compared to the purchasing volume, okay? So this is step number 2, go through each function and define the KPI that you want to benchmark. Step number 3, and this is the most difficult part, is to define the peer group, okay? There are mainly 3 options that you have, okay? Option number 1 is that you take a peer group in the direct competition, okay? So this is like the same industry. So you take the direct competitors. So usually in every market, every company has like 3 to 4 to 5 direct competitors. And this is like the easiest way. So the closest to your client is to benchmark against the same industry, to benchmark against the competitors. This is the first peer group that you can choose. The second peer group that you can choose is that you choose adjacent industries. Okay, so this means, for example, if we what can we say, for example? I mean, it's a adjacent company. So let's say we are talking about sorry, I can't tell you the client I'm currently working for, so I have to choose another industry. Let's say we talk about packaging. Okay, so the direct competitor, if you, for example, do some cups for drinks, plastic cups, then a adjacent competitor would be a packaging company that is not producing cups, but that is rather producing other types of packages. Okay, so maybe a bad example, but I can't think of any better at the moment. Sorry. Okay, so this is the second option, that you can choose adjacent companies. And the third option is that you choose very different companies, okay? That you compare, for example, packaging industry with, I don't know, let's say Google, for example. And this sounds crazy at the beginning. So why should you compare like a packaging company with a company like Google or Amazon or some kind of very top-notch company? The reason is you do that to get kind of inspiration, okay? So maybe you get different ideas if you do not only take a look at your own industry that you are currently in, but also if you compare your client with a company that is outside the actual industry, okay? So these are the three options to choose your peers. It's first direct competition, so the same industry. It's second adjacent industry, so an industry that is close but not the same. And third, it's a very different industry. So for example, like a packaging company against Google, for example. Okay, so this is step number 3, define your peer group. And I promise you and I guarantee you, this is by far the most difficult step, okay, to identify and to choose and to select the right set of peers. Okay, this is very difficult, but I will talk about that in a second. So step number 4 is then finally that you collect the external data. So you collect all the data that you need for the KPIs of your peer group. The 5th step is that you collect the internal data. So obviously you also need some data for the internal benchmarking. Step number 6 is then finally that you compare the numbers and do the analysis. And this is actually where you develop your hypothesis, okay? So imagine what you usually do is that, let's say we compare revenue per FTE in the sales department, then you usually make a column chart where you benchmark the different numbers. And so let's say in your client company, you do 10 million euros per FTE in the sales department, but in your peers, on average do, for example, like 12 million revenue per FTE in the sales department. And this would give you a pretty good idea that your sales department is underperforming the market, okay? And your hypothesis would be, okay, we see we are making 2 million less per FTE compared to our peers. So our hypothesis is that we have significant improvement potential in the sales department, okay? And this is your hypothesis that you can use for the next step, and this is the final step, this is step number 8, is that you validate your hypothesis and do some deep dive analysis. Okay, so for example, after doing the benchmarking and after finding out that we are doing 2 million euros less per FTE than our competitors, we could go and do some interviews to find out why this is, or to do some more detailed analysis to find out, okay, in which areas are we making less revenue than our competitors. So this is where usually where you start, and then you go down and try to validate your hypothesis. And that's it. So these are the 8 steps. Just to summarize, so first of all, you need to define the functions that you want to benchmark. Second, you need to define the KPIs that you want to benchmark. It's third, you have to define the peer group. It's fourth, to collect the external data. It's fifth, to collect the internal data. It's sixth, to actually compare the numbers and to formulate hypothesis. And it's seventh, to actually validate the hypothesis and to do deep dive analysis. So these are the 8 steps, and it's very, in every kind of benchmarking process, you have these 8 steps. So there are probably, there are almost no deviations from this kind of process. Now, I talked about the 8 steps. What I want to share with you now are 3 power tips, okay? These are tips that I find to be helpful and that I found to be very useful within the last 3 years of my consulting experience. Okay, so power tip number 1 is that you think it through. So what do I mean by that? It's very easy that you kind of select the wrong KPI, that you select the wrong peer group because you don't think it through. And this is a mistake that is very common, okay? But it's also very dangerous because doing the benchmarking analysis is a lot of work, okay? So you have to collect the data, you have to make the analysis, then you have to put it on a slide. Usually this is a huge slide deck because you have so many numbers that you crunch. The issue is if you don't think it through at the beginning, chances are very high that you waste a lot of time because let's say you do all the analysis and at the end you find out that you chose the wrong peer group, for example, that you choose a peer group that is not really comparable for some reasons. Or let's say that you want to measure performance of a department and you choose the wrong KPI. And usually you only find this out if you have a deep dive discussion of the results with the client, because this is usually where the client says, okay, or no, these numbers are not comparable, because obviously they hesitate to change something, okay? And what you don't want to do, or what you don't want to have, is that you chose the wrong peer group or the wrong KPI. So it's very important to think it through from the beginning. Think, is the peer group really a reliable peer group? Are the KPIs really the right KPIs to measure performance of the department? So this is tip number one, think it through. Tip number two is plan well in advance. And the reason why I'm saying this is that the data collection and the entire analysis usually takes a lot of time. And you certainly need some buffer. So don't promise the numbers too early, okay? Very often you actually outsource the kind of a data collection to a more specialized firm. And chances are very high that at the beginning you receive not the perfect data set, okay? So expect that there will be some delays and therefore you have to plan well in advance, and you probably should also plan like 1 or 2 weeks as a buffer to have the chance to react in case of certain delays, okay? So this is power tip number 2, plan well in advance. And then power tip number 3 is that you expect resistance from the client. And I can promise you that this will most certainly happen. There are always these 2-3 people at the client who don't want to hear about your benchmark, who say, okay, your numbers are you cannot compare this to our industry because of that and that reason. And this function is very different from our function, so you cannot use this. This KPI doesn't make any sense. So you always have the people who resist or who don't want to hear about your benchmarking. And to be fair, you have to say that very often these guys are kind of right. I mean, because benchmarking, it's always hard to compare, and you can always argue in the one direction or the other, okay? You can always argue that this peer group is the right or the wrong peer group. But fact is that your peer group and your KPIs never will be perfect, okay? So this is for sure. So expect people to resist to who don't want to hear about your analysis. And so expect the resistance. So this is power tip number 3. So just repeat: power tip number 1, think it through from the beginning. Power tip number 2, plan well in advance. And power tip number 3, expect resistance. So that's it. That's from my side about benchmarking. I will go through the questions now, or the comments in the chat. And if you have any questions, then please write now in the chat, because I have to leave in about 5 minutes, because I still have some work to do today and I don't want to go to bed after midnight today. Good, I will go through it. So, and day was quite productive. Your day was quite productive. Very cool. Mine was too. Normalization for this kind of different companies is complex task. Yes, exactly. So, I mean, this is always the difficulty if you do benchmarks. You know, every company is very individual. So it's very hard to compare the companies, because you never will find a company that is exactly like the other company, obviously. So, I mean, but this is always the difficulty that you have if you do benchmarks, okay? On the one hand, it's a very good exercise because you can generate a first hypothesis. On the other hand, those numbers or those hypotheses are not always very reliable, because, I mean, it's very hard to compare companies. It's very hard. Very often you have problems with the data quality. And so making those numbers comparable and making those companies comparable is very difficult. So although benchmarking is a good exercise, keep in mind that it's only the basis for your hypothesis, okay? So don't overrate them in their importance. Then, where do you take the data from other companies? Yes, so most consultancies have their own research center, and you usually don't do research as a consultant, you kind of outsource it. Okay, so there are many specialized firms out there who have access and who actually kind of collect this data. So, there are service providers, the large companies like McKinsey, BCG, and so on, they have their own research department and they usually do it. And smaller companies like Stern Stewart, so the company that I work for, we have a service provider who gives us the data. Okay, so they're usually very specialized companies. Usually they are very focused on one industry and collect benchmarking data over the years. Okay, so you don't collect the data yourself, you usually request it from a data provider. Then great inspiration. Patricia, thank you. It's helpful. I'm glad to hear that. Would it be a good idea to get data from the same company through years to do benchmarks? So through years, this doesn't make any sense. You mean like over several years? Maybe Raul, you can be more specific about that. So yes, it can be a good choice to compare numbers over time. It's always, you can also use kind of growth data, like how did this number change compared to last year, and compare this number to your competitors, okay? So kind of benchmarking certain numbers over years definitely helps to get an understanding in which direction your company or your client is going. But keep in mind that this can be a lot of effort to request this data, because if you don't only request all the function data but also like historical data, then this is going to be a lot of work, and it's also going to be very expensive because obviously you have to pay for the work. But if you're only benchmarking one function, for example, then it can definitely make sense to look into the past and maybe also look to the projections to see where the company is heading. So it also makes sense to compare like a historical data. Yeah, retrospective analysis. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. So are there any more questions? Iterative approach, that's true. So benchmarking is usually although now benchmarking is not that iterative, to be honest. Usually because you have such a big data request, it's iterative in the sense of your problem solving process. There it's iterative because it's the initial starting point for your hypothesis. So that's true. But benchmarking process is usually a very linear process. Okay, so like you discuss the peer set, you discuss the KPI, then you do the data request, and usually it takes 3 or 4 weeks until you get the data, and then you do the analysis. And chances are very low that you then do another benchmarking because it's so much work. Okay, so the benchmarking process itself is more like linear, I would say. But as a part of the whole problem solving process, it's an iterative process. That's true. Good. Where do you get data? I already answered that. How can you ensure that the numbers are true or actual? You can't be sure. So you have to rely on your data provider. That's actually one of the big problems that you have. You should double check it. So for example, FTE numbers are usually very easy to research. Also, if you have some industry experts, you usually interview them as well to get an idea of what they say. To do a kind of quality check of the numbers that you receive. So you have to do that, but it's very difficult, okay? So I think the kind of tools that you use is to do research yourself and to ask industry experts. Good. Then, if you don't have any more questions, then I want to thank you for your time. It was definitely fun for me. I have to get back to work now, unfortunately, to finish a slide. We have a meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. and I have to do work until then. But please let me know. This was more like an advanced topic. Okay, talking about benchmarking is maybe not that relevant for all the very, very, very junior people. But please let me know if this brings value to you. Okay, so I can definitely talk more about the actual project and more advanced topics, like how to do a transformation project, for example, how to do, I don't know, process analysis and all these project types. So if you're interested in that, then please also write me a personal message to give me feedback. And with that being said, tomorrow next live will be also at 10 p.m. CET. And with that being said, I wish you a very great evening and a very good start to the week. It was, as always, a pleasure. Goodbye and talk to you tomorrow.